May 2, 2025. A 911 call from rural Nova Scotia shatters the morning silence. 2 children have vanished. 6-year-old Lily Sullivan and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan, gone without a trace from their isolated home on Gearlock Road. Their mother's voice cracks with panic as she tells the dispatcher her babies disappeared while she and her husband were just in the other room. Within hours, helicopters circle overhead, search dogs comb through dense wilderness, volunteers organize into grid patterns covering miles of unforgiving terrain. The story seems straightforward at first: 2 young children wandered into the forest and got lost. It's every parent's nightmare, the kind of tragedy that grips a community and reminds us how quickly the unthinkable can happen. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to the Case Files Collective and smash that like button. What you're about to hear isn't just another true crime story. This is an active investigation where newly unsealed court documents have revealed details so disturbing that even seasoned investigators are struggling to make sense of what happened. Your engagement helps push this case into more feeds and keeps pressure on investigators to find answers for 2 children who deserve justice. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today and what time it is there. These interactions matter more than you think. But court documents that remained sealed for 7 months have finally been released to the public. And what they reveal tears apart that simple narrative completely. This wasn't a tragic accident. This wasn't children innocently wandering off to explore. May 1, 2025, started as an ordinary spring day in Pictou County. Lily had a persistent cough, so Lily Brooks Murray kept both children home from school. By afternoon, the family decided on an outing to New Glasgow. At 2:25 p.m., Dollarama security cameras captured the last verified footage of the children alive, Lily holding her mother's hand, Jack trailing behind with his signature dinosaur backpack. The timestamp read 2:25 and 17 seconds p.m. That footage would become the most important piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Traffic cameras tracked the family vehicle as it wound through rural roads. A camera near Pictou County caught them at 3:08 p.m. heading toward home. The final traffic camera, positioned 5 kilometers from Gearlock Road, recorded them passing at 4:15 p.m. By 4:25 p.m. at the latest, everyone was back at the isolated property. Lily and Jack were home. They were alive. They were with their mother and stepfather. Then, silence. For the next 17 hours and 46 minutes, only 2 people claimed to know what happened to Lily and Jack, their mother and stepfather. No neighbors saw them. Daniel's mother, Janie Mackenzie, who lived in a separate building on the same isolated property, didn't interact with them that evening. The children simply vanished into a timeline controlled entirely by 2 adults whose stories would soon unravel under scrutiny. The official story was that they arrived home, spent a normal evening, put the kids to bed around 9 or 10 p.m. A completely ordinary evening. Nothing unusual. But there's no evidence backing it up. No text messages referencing the children. No photos taken. No phone calls to family. No pizza delivery that would have put another witness at the house. Nothing but the word of Lily Brooks Murray and Daniel Martel that Lily and Jack made it through that evening alive. And what investigators would discover in the coming weeks would make that 17-hour window of silence the most critical and most suspicious period in the entire case. At 10:01 a.m. on May 2, Lily Brooks Murray's frantic voice crackled through the emergency dispatcher's headset. Her children were missing. They were gone. The panic in her voice seemed genuine, raw, the kind of terror that grips a parent when they realize their babies are nowhere to be found. She explained that sometime between 8 o'clock and 9:40 that morning, while she and Daniel were in their bedroom with their 1-year-old daughter Meadow, Lily and Jack had disappeared from the house. Daniel claimed he'd heard Jack moving around in the kitchen earlier, heard the sounds of a young child doing normal morning things, maybe getting himself something to eat or drink. He said he'd heard Lily going in and out of the bedroom several times during that period. Then suddenly, he noticed the house had gone quiet. Too quiet. Parents of young children know that silence is often more alarming than noise. When they emerged from the bedroom to check on the children, Lily and Jack were gone. Not in their rooms. Not in the kitchen where Jack had been heard just moments before. Not anywhere in the house. Simply gone. Daniel told the dispatcher he'd immediately searched the property, calling their names, checking the outbuildings, looking in places where children might hide during a game. Nothing. No response. No sign of them. He insisted that a wrench he'd placed on top of the front door the night before as a makeshift security measure was still in place, undisturbed. That meant the children couldn't have exited through the front door. The only explanation, according to Daniel's account, was that they'd somehow slipped out the back sliding door, the one he claimed normally operated almost silently, and wandered into the dense, dangerous wilderness surrounding their property. The dispatcher kept Lily on the line while alerting the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and local emergency services. Within 30 minutes, the first officers arrived at the isolated Gearlock Road property. Within 2 hours, a full-scale search operation was mobilizing. This wasn't a casual effort. This was every available resource being thrown at finding 2 small children who'd allegedly wandered into one of Nova Scotia's most unforgiving wilderness areas. Over 100 volunteers showed up, neighbors and strangers alike responding to the desperate call for help. RCMP officers from multiple detachments converged on Pictou County. Specialized search and rescue teams, people trained for exactly this kind of operation, arrived with equipment designed to locate missing persons in dense terrain. Cadaver dogs were deployed, highly trained animals capable of detecting human remains even in challenging conditions. These weren't just pet dogs with good noses. These were specialists, animals that had spent years training to distinguish human scent from the thousands of other organic smells in a forest environment. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras lifted off, their technology capable of detecting body heat even through moderate tree cover. The cameras could identify the heat signature of a living person from hundreds of feet in the air, could spot someone huddled under vegetation or tucked into a crevice that ground searchers might miss. Drones joined the aerial search, flying grid patterns over areas too dense or too dangerous for ground teams to access safely. For days, this massive operation continued. Searchers combed through terrain so thick that experienced rescuers had to move slowly to avoid injury. The forest surrounding Gearlock Road wasn't a pleasant walking trail. This was dense undergrowth, steep ravines, areas where visibility dropped to just a few meters. The kind of wilderness where even adults could easily become disoriented and lost. The kind of place where 2 small children, one of them just 4 years old, would face immediate and severe danger from exposure, from falls, from simply not knowing which direction led to safety. And they found nothing. Not a single trace. Not one footprint beyond the immediate property line that could definitively be attributed to Lily and Jack. No torn pieces of clothing snagged on branches at the height where a 6-year-old or 4-year-old would brush against them. No dropped belongings, no toys, no items from their pockets. The cadaver dogs picked up faint scent traces near the house but lost them within meters, as if the children had simply evaporated. The thermal imaging revealed no heat signatures hiding in the forest. The ground searches turned up nothing despite covering miles of territory in expanding circles from the property. It defied every logical expectation. 2 children don't simply vanish into thin air. They leave traces. They disturb vegetation as they push through it. They leave footprints in soft soil. They drop things. They leave scent trails that dogs can follow. But Lily and Jack Sullivan had done none of those things, or so the evidence suggested. The massive search operation that should have found them within hours or days instead found absolutely nothing, as if the children had never entered that wilderness at all. The Sullivan property wasn't a typical suburban home with neighbors watching from adjacent yards. This was isolation in its purest form. Situated on Gearlock Road in the remote community of Lansdowne Station, the house sat surrounded by dense forest, steep ravines, and wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. The kind of place where screams wouldn't carry to the nearest neighbor. The kind of place where unusual activity at odd hours would go completely unnoticed. The kind of place where what happened inside stayed inside, hidden from the watchful eyes that exist in more populated neighborhoods. The nearest neighbor lived far enough away that they wouldn't hear arguments, wouldn't notice cars coming and going at strange times, wouldn't see anything that might later become important to investigators trying to piece together what really happened. Lily Brooks Murray was 28 years old, a mother struggling under the weight of responsibilities that seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. 3 young children to care for, including a 1-year-old who still required constant attention. Bills that kept piling up faster than paychecks could cover them. A relationship with Daniel Martel that family members would later describe as volatile and unstable. She'd separated from the children's biological father, Cody Sullivan, years earlier after their relationship deteriorated into the kind of dysfunction that makes shared custody impossible. Cody had lost parental rights after struggling with addiction and instability, unable to provide the safe, consistent environment children need. For 3 years, he'd had no contact with Lily and Jack, no visitation rights, no involvement in their daily lives. Daniel Martel was 31, Malia's partner and the stepfather to Lily and Jack. He was the biological father of their 1-year-old daughter, Meadow, but had no legal relationship to the older children beyond living in the same house. Family members who knew him would later tell investigators about his temper, about employment instability that meant the family never knew if there'd be steady income from one month to the next. They'd describe a man who sometimes seemed too harsh with the children, whose patience wore thin quickly, who struggled with the daily demands of helping raise kids who weren't biologically his. But these were observations from the outside, family members who visited occasionally and saw snapshots of life rather than the complete picture. The household dynamics were complicated in ways that extended beyond just Lily and Daniel's relationship. Extended family members would later describe frequent arguments between the couple, disagreements that were sometimes loud enough to be heard by people visiting the property. The fights were about money, always money, the grinding stress of not having enough to cover basic needs. They argued about parenting approaches, about discipline, about whose responsibility it was to handle various aspects of raising 3 children. They argued about jealousy and trust, the kind of relationship friction that builds when 2 people are under constant financial and emotional pressure. Several family members would tell investigators they'd had concerns about Daniel specifically. Nothing concrete enough to report to authorities, nothing they could point to as definitive evidence of abuse or danger, but a general unease about his temperament and his interactions with Lily and Jack. He could be too harsh in his discipline, they said. He lost his temper over small things. He seemed resentful at times of the burden of helping raise children who weren't his biological offspring. But concern isn't proof. Unease isn't evidence. And none of these family members had called Child Protective Services themselves, which suggests that whatever worries they harbored weren't severe enough in their assessment to warrant intervention. One particularly disturbing detail would emerge from family interviews conducted after the children disappeared. In the weeks before May 2, Lily had reportedly told a family member that she was completely overwhelmed. The phrase she allegedly used was that she was drowning, that caring for 3 young children while dealing with financial problems and relationship stress was more than she could handle. She'd allegedly made a comment about wishing she could just start over, have a fresh start without all the complications and responsibilities that weighed her down every single day. The family member who reported this conversation said Lily seemed desperate, exhausted in a way that went beyond normal parental fatigue. Daniel's mother, Janie Mackenzie, lived in a separate building on the same property. She had her own space, her own routine, her own life that intersected with but didn't completely overlap with what was happening in the main house. This physical proximity would make her a crucial witness, someone who lived close enough to potentially see or hear things that would help investigators understand what happened. But it also meant she wasn't constantly monitoring activities in the main house, wasn't aware of every interaction, every argument, every moment of tension that might have been building toward tragedy. By early 2025, there was another source of stress that family members believe was weighing on Mally IA and Daniel. Cody Sullivan, the biological father who'd been absent for 3 years, had gotten his life together. He'd completed treatment programs for his addiction. He'd maintained stable employment and housing for over a year. He'd stayed clean, proved he could be responsible, demonstrated that he'd changed from the person who'd lost custody years earlier. And he was considering petitioning the court for some restoration of parental rights. Maybe supervised visitation to start. Maybe working towards shared custody eventually. He wanted to be part of his children's lives again. He wanted Lily and Jack to know their biological father. The massive search operation that deployed across Pictou County in the days following May 2 should have found something. In missing persons cases involving young children, especially in wilderness areas, searchers typically locate evidence within the first 24 to 48 hours. A piece of clothing caught on a branch. Footprints in soft soil near a stream. A toy dropped along a path. Some indication of which direction the missing person traveled. But the search for Lily and Jack Sullivan defied every statistical expectation and every piece of conventional wisdom about how these operations typically unfold. Over 100 volunteers, many of them experienced in wilderness search and rescue, combed through terrain that ranged from merely difficult to genuinely dangerous. They moved in carefully organized grid patterns, each searcher responsible for visually clearing a specific section of forest. They called the children's names continuously, hoping that if Lily and Jack were injured or trapped somewhere, they'd hear familiar voices and cry out for help. They checked ravines where a child might have fallen. They examined dense thickets where someone small might have crawled seeking shelter. They looked in every hollow tree, every natural depression in the ground, every location where exhausted or frightened children might have stopped to rest. The Cadaver dogs, some of the most highly trained K-9 units available in Atlantic Canada, picked up faint scent trails near the house. These dogs are extraordinary animals, capable of detecting human scent in concentrations so minute that technological instruments can't match their sensitivity. But in this case, the dogs would pick up traces near the property and then lose them within meters, as if the scent simply stopped existing. No trailing off into the forest. No gradual weakening as distance increased. Just presence near the house, then nothing. Thermal imaging helicopters flew grid patterns over the entire search area, their cameras capable of detecting body heat even through moderate tree cover. The cameras detected wildlife and searchers on the ground, their thermal signatures bright and obvious. But they detected no sign of 2 small children anywhere in the vast area surrounding Gearlock Road. Ground teams found no footprints beyond the immediate property line that could definitively be attributed to Lily and Jack. No disturbed vegetation. No broken branches at child height. The forest showed no evidence that children had passed through it at all. Then the Cadaver dogs did something that fundamentally changed the investigation. They showed interest in specific locations inside the house and around the yard. Not full trained alerts indicating definite presence of human remains, but persistent interest behavior. Sniffing intensely at particular spots. Circling back repeatedly. The dogs showed this behavior in several locations. Areas inside the main house. Spots in the yard near the play equipment. Areas near the tree line where the maintained property met the wild forest. Forensic teams moved in immediately, treating these locations as potential evidence sites. They sprayed luminol, collected soil samples from 6 different locations, and deployed ground-penetrating radar across the property. The results of all this forensic analysis remain heavily redacted in recently unsealed court documents. We know the tests were conducted. We know what investigators were looking for. But we don't know what they found. When investigators obtained warrants for the family's electronic devices, they uncovered a chilling digital trail that transformed this case from a potential tragic accident into something far more sinister. In the 72 hours before May 2, someone in that household had been conducting very specific internet searches. These weren't casual queries sparked by watching a true crime documentary or reading a news article. These were targeted, methodical searches that suggested someone was carefully considering what happens when children go missing and how to avoid detection during the investigation that would inevitably follow. The searches included queries about how long children can survive in cold weather conditions. What methods do police use to find missing persons? How extensive are search operations for missing children? What evidence do investigators look for in disappearance cases? What mistakes do people make that lead to getting caught? The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was researching the very scenario that would unfold just days later, gathering information about investigative procedures, search protocols, survival timelines. This wasn't innocent curiosity. This was preparation. The timing made these searches absolutely damning. They occurred in the 3 days leading up to May 2nd. In the 72 hours before Lily and Jack were reported missing, someone in that house was Googling topics directly related to missing children investigations. That's not coincidence. That's someone thinking very carefully about what was about to happen and how to handle the aftermath. When investigators confronted both Lily and Daniel about these searches during formal interviews, the responses were evasive and inconsistent. One claimed not to remember making such searches. The other suggested it might have been research for something completely unrelated but couldn't specify what. Neither provided a credible explanation for why those specific topics were being researched at that specific time. Then there were the financial records. Investigators obtained court orders to examine bank statements, credit card transactions, and any financial activity in the months leading up to the disappearance. What they found raised serious questions that neither Lily nor Daniel has ever adequately answered. The family was struggling financially, that much was already known. They were behind on rent, had maxed out credit cards, Daniel's employment was sporadic at best. But in the 2 weeks before the children disappeared, there were unusual cash withdrawals from Malia's bank account. Not small amounts. One withdrawal of $800. Another of $600. A third of $450. Over $2,000 in cash withdrawn in the 14 days before May 2nd. When investigators asked Lily about these withdrawals during interviews, she reportedly couldn't provide clear, specific explanations. She said it was for various expenses around the house. Said they needed things but couldn't remember specifically what. Said maybe Daniel would know what it was for. But when investigators asked Daniel, he gave different answers. Said Lily handled the finances. Said he didn't know about specific withdrawals. Said maybe it was for bills, though most of their bills were paid electronically and there's no evidence of corresponding bill payments that would account for over $2,000 in cash. Large cash withdrawals aren't inherently suspicious. People withdraw cash for legitimate reasons all the time. But in the context of an investigation into missing children who may have been harmed, where investigators are looking for any indication of planning or unusual behavior, unexplained cash withdrawals totaling over $2,000 get serious attention. Cash purchases leave no electronic trail. If you need to buy tools or supplies for something criminal, you pay cash. If you need to purchase cleaning supplies in large quantities without anyone noticing a suspicious bulk purchase at a single store, you pay cash at multiple locations. The fact is, over $2,000 in cash left that bank account in the 2 weeks before the children vanished, and no one can credibly explain where it went or what it was used for. The gas station footage from the night of May 1st should have been the breakthrough that cracked the case wide open. At 11:47 p.m. Security cameras at a rural gas station approximately 30 kilometers from the Sullivan property captured a vehicle matching the description of Daniel Martel's dark pickup truck. The footage wasn't perfect. It was nighttime, the lighting at small rural gas stations isn't always ideal, and the camera angles didn't capture every detail with crystal clarity. But forensic video analysts who examined the footage frame by frame determined there was a high probability, over 80% certainty, that the vehicle in the footage was Martel's truck. The body style matched. The modifications matched. What appeared to be the license plate number matched, though the plate wasn't fully clear due to camera angle and lighting conditions. The footage shows a single male figure exiting the vehicle and pumping gas. The individual is wearing dark clothing, a hoodie pulled up over his head, making facial identification difficult. But the build matched Daniel Martel. The height matched. The mannerisms, the way he moved, the way he carried himself, all matched. The individual pumps gas for several minutes, then walks into the gas station's convenience store. Interior cameras captured him inside for approximately 4 minutes. He browsed various sections of the store, picked up items and put them back, appeared distracted or agitated based on body language analysis that investigators would conduct later. He eventually purchased a few items, the exact nature of which couldn't be definitively determined from the footage, and left. Here's why this matters so profoundly. According to Daniel Martel's statement to police, his detailed timeline of movements on May 1st, he was home all evening. He said Lilly went to bed around 9 or 10 p.m. He said he stayed up later but remained at the house, watching television or scrolling on his phone, just a normal evening at home. He made absolutely no mention of leaving the property that night. When investigators compile timelines in cases like this, they ask suspects to account for their time hour by hour. Where were you? What were you doing? Who can verify it? Martel's timeline for the night of May 1st had him at home from dinner time through the entire night until the morning of May 2nd when the children allegedly disappeared. So if that security footage shows him at a gas station at 11:47 p.m., 30 kilometers from home, he lied to police about his movements on the last night anyone can verify his stepchildren were alive. That's not a small detail. That's not a minor discrepancy that could be chalked up to confusion or memory error. That's a provable, demonstrable lie about his whereabouts during a critical time period. When investigators confronted Daniel Martel with this security footage during subsequent interviews, his response evolved in ways that only increased suspicion and made him look more guilty with each changing version of his story. Initially, he flatly denied it was him. Said it must have been someone else with a similar truck. Said the footage was too grainy to be sure of anything. Denied leaving the house that night. Insisted his original timeline was accurate. But when investigators pushed back, when they pointed out the license plate match and the physical similarity and the fact that they were confident beyond reasonable doubt it was him, his story changed completely. Then he said okay, maybe he did go out that night. He'd forgotten about it because of all the stress surrounding the missing children, the emotional trauma of the search, the exhaustion of being questioned repeatedly. Maybe he went to get cigarettes or some snacks. It just slipped his mind when he was giving his initial timeline. Just a quick trip to the store. Nothing significant. That's why he forgot to mention it. But investigators checked every detail of that new story. They looked at what that particular gas station sells, examined inventory lists, talked to employees. The store doesn't sell cigarettes, which was specifically what Martel claimed he went to buy. And Martel's bank records show no debit or credit card transaction at that location that night, which means if he did make a purchase, he paid cash. Cash from those unexplained withdrawals that neither he nor Lilly could account for. What was he really doing 30 kilometers from home at nearly midnight on the last night those children were seen alive? Janie Mackenzie's testimony seemed straightforward at first, the kind of witness statement that should have provided crucial verification of the timeline. On the morning of May 2nd, around 8:50 a.m., she heard children laughing outside. She heard the rhythmic creaking of swing chains, that distinctive metallic sound that playground equipment makes when it's in use. She heard what sounded like young kids having fun on a spring morning, the kind of normal, innocent sounds that should have been comforting. She was still in bed in her separate building on the property, heard those sounds drifting through her window, and went back to sleep, reassured by the normalcy of children playing outside on a beautiful morning. But under intensive police questioning, under the kind of detailed examination that investigators conduct when they need to know exactly what a witness can verify versus what they assumed or interpreted, a critical detail emerged. Janie Mackenzie never actually saw the children that morning. She never looked out the window to visually confirm it was Lily and Jack on those swings. She never went outside to interact with them, never called out a greeting, never laid eyes on them at all. She was in her separate building, lying in bed, heard sounds she interpreted as children playing, and assumed it was her grandchildren. She heard laughter. She heard swings moving. But she never had visual confirmation of who or what was creating those sounds. This distinction is absolutely critical to understanding the timeline and the potential for deception in this case. If Janie Mackenzie didn't actually see Lily and Jack on the morning of May 2nd, then we have no independent verification that those children were alive that morning. All we have are sounds, and sounds can be replicated, manipulated, manufactured to create false evidence. This might sound like reaching for conspiracy theories, like suggesting something too elaborate to be plausible. But think about it practically, from the perspective of someone who needed to create a false timeline. If you needed to establish that children were alive and playing at a certain time when they actually weren't, how would you accomplish that? You could play recordings of children's laughter from a phone or speaker placed outside. You could push empty swings yourself to create the creaking sound of chains moving. You could make noise that someone hearing from a distance, not seeing the source directly, would naturally interpret as kids playing. It wouldn't require elaborate equipment or technical expertise. Just a phone with recorded audio and a few minutes of creating sounds that match what a witness would expect to hear on a normal morning. Why would someone go to such lengths? To establish a false timeline that serves their narrative. If something terrible had happened to the children during the evening of May 1st or during the night, if they'd died or been harmed during those 17 unwitnessed hours when only Mally IA and Daniel claimed to know what occurred, then the people responsible would need to explain why they didn't report it immediately. But if they could create evidence, even just witness testimony based on sounds rather than visual confirmation, that the children were alive late the next morning, then the story of them wandering off around 9:40 a.m. becomes more plausible. The timeline shifts forward, creating distance between when something terrible actually occurred and when it was reported. It provides a buffer, a period of time that can be explained away as normal morning routine rather than the crucial hours when a crime was being covered up. Investigators absolutely considered this possibility seriously. They examined whether the sounds Janie heard could have been manufactured. They looked at the logistics of creating auditory evidence without the children actually being present. They analyzed the layout of the property, the distance between Janie's building and where the swing set was located, the kinds of sounds that would carry that distance. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. What's the weather like where you are right now? Are you watching this on a sunny day, during a rainstorm, on a cold winter evening? Drop a comment and let us know. These small interactions help push this video to more people, keep this case in the public consciousness, and increase the chances that someone with information will finally come forward. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss any updates on this case. The conclusion investigators reached, though it's not explicitly stated in the documents, is that yes, it's absolutely possible those sounds were manufactured. Which means Janie's testimony, while honest and well-meaning on her part, doesn't actually prove the children were alive on the morning of May 2nd. Weeks before Lily and Jack disappeared, an elementary school teacher made a decision that would haunt her forever. She'd been noticing concerning signs for some time, the kind of subtle indicators that experienced educators are trained to recognize as potential red flags. 4-year-old Jack had come to school with unexplained bruises, particularly on his arms and legs, marks that didn't fit the typical patterns of childhood clumsiness. When she asked him gently how he got hurt, his explanations were vague, inconsistent, sometimes nonsensical in ways that suggested he either didn't remember or was afraid to tell the truth. He seemed more withdrawn than usual, quieter during activities where he'd normally be engaged and energetic, displaying behavioral changes that concerned teachers recognize as distress signals. The teacher, a mandated reporter who'd been trained extensively to recognize signs of abuse and neglect, made the difficult decision to file a formal concern report with Nova Scotia's Child Protective Services. She documented the bruising she'd observed, noted the dates and her conversations with Jack, described the behavioral changes she'd witnessed over the previous weeks. She followed the protocol exactly as she'd been trained, submitting the report through proper channels and trusting that the system designed to protect vulnerable children would investigate and intervene if necessary. She believed she was doing the right thing, potentially saving a child from ongoing harm, acting on instincts and training that told her something wasn't right in that household. What happened next epitomizes a system failure that costs lives far too often in jurisdictions across North America. Child Protective Services in Nova Scotia, like similar agencies in most regions, operates chronically understaffed and desperately overwhelmed. Social workers carry caseloads that are double or triple what experts recommend as manageable. They're triaging constantly, making impossible decisions about which cases represent immediate critical danger requiring urgent intervention and which cases can be monitored less intensively or placed on waiting lists for follow-up. The teacher's report about Jack Sullivan was received. A file was opened. Notes were entered into the database. But whether a social worker ever visited the Sullivan home before the children disappeared, whether Lily and Daniel were ever interviewed about the bruising and behavioral concerns, whether Jack was ever examined by a medical professional to determine if the injury patterns were consistent with accidental harm or suggested abuse, those details remain sealed under privacy laws designed to protect families from having their child welfare investigations made public. What we know with certainty is this: no intervention occurred substantial enough to remove the children from potential danger. No urgent action was taken that would have placed Lily and Jack in protective custody or mandated supervised visitation or triggered the kind of intensive oversight that happens when social workers determine children are at imminent risk. The report likely joined thousands of others in a system drowning in case loads, triaged as concerning but not immediately critical, assigned for follow-up that may or may not have occurred before tragedy struck. Within weeks of that report being filed, both children were gone, vanished under circumstances that investigators strongly suspect involved foul play rather than accidental disappearance. The teacher's instincts had been absolutely correct. Something was wrong in that household. Something dangerous was happening to at least one of those children, visible enough that it manifested in physical injuries and behavioral changes observable to someone who spent time with Jack during school hours. But the warning came too late, or was lost in bureaucratic process, or wasn't acted upon with the urgency it deserved. Now investigators were left piecing together whether that documented history of suspected abuse was simply a warning sign of dysfunction in the household or direct evidence that the children were already in danger, already suffering harm that would escalate to whatever happened during those 17 unwitnessed hours. The knowledge that someone recognized the danger, reported it through proper channels, trusted the system to protect these children, and then watched helplessly as that system failed to prevent their disappearance adds another layer of tragedy to an already devastating case. It raises uncomfortable questions about how many other children are slipping through similar cracks, how many reports are filed by concerned teachers or doctors or neighbors that don't receive adequate follow-up, how many warning signs are missed or ignored until it's too late. For Lily and Jack Sullivan, the warning came but the help never arrived. And now a teacher lives with the knowledge that she tried to save them and the system didn't respond in time. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, Lily Brooks Murray did something that would become critically important to investigators trying to understand the true dynamics of this case. She left the property where her children had vanished, traveled to stay with family in another part of Nova Scotia, and blocked Daniel Martel on all social media platforms. The separation happened quickly, within just days of the massive search operation beginning, suggesting that whatever trust or partnership had existed between them had shattered completely under the pressure of their children disappearing. Family members who hosted Lily during those days would later provide statements to police about what they witnessed, what they heard, what Lily said when she thought she was speaking privately among people she trusted. Those family members reported hearing explosive statements that went far beyond normal grief or confusion. Lily was devastated, crying constantly, barely eating, unable to sleep, all of which would be entirely expected behavior for a mother whose children have just vanished. But she was also angry, specifically and pointedly angry at Daniel Martel. Family members heard her say things like "this is all his fault, he knows what happened to them, I should have protected them from him, I should have left him before this happened. These weren't vague expressions of someone looking for anyone to blame in their overwhelming pain. These were direct accusations. Even without explicitly saying he killed them or harmed them, she was clearly indicating she believed Daniel was responsible in some way, that she perceived him as a threat to her children's safety, that she regretted not acting on that perception before tragedy struck. When investigators followed up on these statements, when they interviewed Lily directly and asked her to explain exactly what she meant by those accusations, her story changed dramatically and suspiciously. She walked everything back. Said she was just upset and wasn't thinking clearly. Said she was looking for someone to blame because the pain was unbearable and she needed a target for her anguish. Insisted she didn't actually think Daniel had harmed the children. Said he wasn't perfect, that their relationship had problems, but she didn't believe he was capable of violence against Lily and Jack. The transformation from direct accusations to complete exoneration happened over the course of just a few conversations with police. The change became even more dramatic when, after several weeks of separation, Lily reunited with Daniel. They moved back in together, resumed their relationship, and began presenting a completely united front to police, to media, to anyone asking questions about what happened on May 2nd. Their stories aligned down to the smallest details. They supported each other's accounts. They defended each other against the growing suspicion from investigators and the public. The woman who'd said he knows what happened and I should have protected them from him was now standing beside him, holding his hand, insisting they were both innocent victims of a terrible tragedy. But investigators understand something crucial about human behavior under stress. First instincts, unguarded statements made before someone has time to calculate the implications or coordinate a story with others, often reveal truth that later carefully crafted statements conceal. Malia's initial reaction, expressed to family members she trusted in what she believed were private conversations, was to blame Daniel, to say he knew what happened, to express regret about not protecting her children from him. Everything that came after, the reconciliation, the unified story, the walking back of accusations, looked like something else entirely to experienced investigators. Was it fear? Was Lily afraid of Daniel, afraid of what he might do if she continued accusing him, returning to him because she felt she had no other choice? Was it self-preservation? Did she realize that if Daniel was guilty, her own knowledge or suspicions or failure to protect the children might make her legally culpable as well, leading her to align with him rather than risk prosecution? Or was it a conscious decision by two people who both knew the truth to maintain their cover story regardless of what actually happened, to present a united front because separation and accusations would only invite more scrutiny and make investigators more certain something criminal had occurred? The pattern of behavior, the initial accusations followed by complete reversal, the separation followed by reconciliation, all of it created a picture of complicated dynamics that investigators were still trying to fully understand. What they knew for certain was that Malia's first unguarded instinct had been to blame Daniel. And that meant something, even if she later denied it meant anything at all. If you're finding this coverage valuable, if you want to see continued in-depth analysis of cases that deserve answers, hit that like button right now and share this video. The more people who see this, the more pressure stays on investigators, the better the chances that someone with critical information will finally come forward. Your engagement directly impacts whether this case stays in the public eye or fades into obscurity. December 2025. 7 months since Lily Sullivan and Jack Sullivan vanished from their rural Nova Scotia home. 7 months of investigation producing volumes of suspicious evidence but no bodies, no arrests, no definitive proof of what happened during those 17 hours when only 2 people claimed to know the truth. The newly unsealed court documents paint a damning picture that's impossible to ignore. Internet searches about how children die from exposure and how police investigate disappearances, conducted in the 72 hours before the children vanished. Over $2,000 in unexplained cash withdrawals with no accounting for where that money went or what it purchased. A stepfather caught on security camera 30 kilometers from home at midnight on the last night the children were confirmed alive, a trip he initially denied completely, then couldn't explain credibly when confronted with video evidence. A grandmother who heard children playing on swings that morning but crucially never saw them, never visually confirmed that the sounds she heard were actually Lily and Jack rather than manufactured audio designed to establish a false timeline. Cadaver dogs showing persistent interest in locations around the property, sniffing and circling areas inside the house and in the yard in ways that suggested they detected something even if not at levels strong enough for definitive alerts. Soil samples collected from 6 suspicious areas and tested for decomposition chemicals, with results that remain sealed and redacted from public documents. Polygraph examinations that left investigators deeply unsatisfied with the responses and physiological reactions of both parents. A mother who initially blamed the stepfather directly, said he knows what happened, said she should have protected her children from him, then walked back every accusation and reunited with him to present a coordinated story. A biological father with an airtight alibi, cleared completely of any involvement. A teacher who filed a Child Protective Services report about unexplained bruising on Jack weeks before the disappearance, a warning that was received but apparently not acted upon with sufficient urgency. A massive search operation involving over 100 volunteers, specialized cadaver dogs, thermal imaging helicopters, and ground-penetrating radar that found absolutely nothing in the wilderness where 2 small children allegedly wandered. No footprints, no torn clothing, no scent trails, no trace whatsoever suggesting Lily and Jack ever entered that forest. And a $150,000 reward that remains unclaimed 7 months later, despite the significant financial motivation that kind of money represents in a region where many families struggle economically. Yet despite all this evidence, despite the lies and inconsistencies and suspicious behaviors documented extensively in police files, no charges have been filed against anyone. Because suspicion, however strong and however well-founded, isn't proof that would hold up in court. Inconsistencies in stories, however damning they appear, aren't proof beyond reasonable doubt. Lies about midnight drives and unexplained cash withdrawals and disturbing internet searches, none of it constitutes definitive proof that 2 children were murdered rather than lost. Without bodies, without physical evidence of a crime that can be presented to a jury, without a confession from someone involved, prosecutors face an enormous challenge securing a conviction that would satisfy the legal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. So the investigation continues, slower now than in those frantic first weeks but still active, still pursuing leads. Tips still come in occasionally, called into the dedicated line that remains open 24 hours a day. Forensic analysis continues on evidence seized months ago, specialists examining and re-examining materials hoping to find something previously missed. And somewhere, someone knows exactly what happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan during those 17 hours of silence between 4:15 p.m. on May 1st and 10:01 a.m. on May 2nd. Whether conscience or the substantial financial reward or simply the unbearable weight of carrying that secret will eventually break the silence remains to be seen. This is where you come in. If you have any information about this case, any detail no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, contact the RCMP tip line immediately. $150,000 is being offered for information leading to resolution. But more important than any reward is the chance to bring 2 children home, to give them the dignity of a proper burial, to ensure that whoever is responsible faces justice. Share this video everywhere. Post it on your social media. Send it to people you know in Nova Scotia or anyone who might have connections to this case. The more people who see this, the more likely it becomes that someone with crucial information will finally come forward. Subscribe to the Case Files Collective for continued coverage, hit that notification bell, and stay engaged. These children deserve answers. And we won't stop demanding them until the truth finally comes to light.